All right, so that worked. Here is section 2 of chapter 10, entitled The Jacksonian Presidency, 1829 to 1837. I'm going to turn my lamp on just a moment so I can actually see what I'm reading. Hopefully your surgery has gone well, Noah, and that you're feeling okay. I'm trying to vary my tone so that you don't get bored to death. I'll try to throw some jokes in for you too. How's that? All right, so here we go. American-style political democracy, a broad franchise, a disciplined political party, and policies favoring specific interests ushered Andrew Jackson into office. Jackson used his popular mandate to transform the policies of the national government and the definition of the presidency. During his 2 terms, he enhanced presidential authority, destroyed the mercantilist and nationalist American system, and established a new ideology of limited government. An Ohio supporter summed up Jackson's vision: the sovereignty of the people, the rights of the states, and a light and simple government. A couple of things to keep in mind before I move on in the reading is that the Jacksonian Democrats are kind of what took root, and they really flourished in the South. They were the conservatives, whereas the Republicans that will be born up north following the decline of the Whig Party will kind of be your liberals. And then over American history, the Democrats and the Republican political ideologies tend to flip-flop. So as I'm mentioning Democrats now, it's not the same as modern Democrats, because the Democrats of the 1800s and early 1900s are more of today's Republican conservatives, and vice versa. So just keep that in mind when I'm saying Democrats here. All right, next part, Jackson's agenda, rotation, and decentralization. To make policy, Jackson relied primarily on his so-called kitchen cabinet. Its most influential members were 2 Kentuckians, Francis Preston Blair, who edited the Washington Globe, and Amos Kendall, who wrote Jackson's speeches. Roger B. Taney of Maryland, who became Attorney General, Treasury Secretary, and then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Martin Van Buren, whom Jackson named Secretary of State. Buren's example in New York, Jackson used patronage to create a disciplined national party. He rejected the idea of property in office, meaning that a qualified official held a permanent position permanently, and insisted on a rotation of office holders when a new administration took power, which is what we see now. Rotation would not lessen expertise, Jackson insisted, because public duties were so plain and simple that men of intelligence may readily qualify themselves for their performance. William L. Marcy, a New York Jacksonian, offered a more realistic explanation for rotation. Government jobs were like the spoils of war, and to the victor belonged the spoils of the enemy. Jackson used those spoils to reward his allies and win backing for his policies. Jackson's highest priority was to destroy the American system. Henry Clay's system and all government-sponsored plans for national economic development were contrary to the Constitution, encouraged consolidated government, their tariffs increased the burden of taxation. As Clay noted apprehensively, the new president wanted to cry down expansive Hamiltonian constructions of the Constitution, to make all Jefferson's opinions the articles of faith of the new church. Declaring that the voice of the people called for economy in the expenditures of the government, Jackson rejected national subsidies for transportation projects. Invoking constitutional arguments, he vetoed 4 internal improvement bills in 1830, including an extension of the national road, arguing that they infringed on the reserved powers of states. By eliminating potential expenditures by the federal government, these vetoes also undermined the case for protective tariffs. As Jacksonian Senator William Smith of South Carolina pointed out, destroy internal improvements and you leave no motive for the tariff. So we're going to look at the tariff and nullification on page 323. The tariff of 1828 had helped Jackson win the presidency, but it saddled him with a major political crisis. There was fierce opposition to high tariffs throughout the South, and especially in South Carolina. That state was the only one with an African-American majority, 56% of the population in 1830, and its slave owners, like the white sugar planters in the West Indies, feared a black rebellion. Even more, they worried about the legal abolition of slavery. The British Parliament had declared that slavery in its West Indian colonies would end in 1833. South Carolina planters, vividly recalling Northern efforts to end slavery in Missouri, worried that the U.S. Congress would follow the British lead. So they attacked the tariff, both to lower rates and to discourage the use of federal power to attack slavery. The crisis began in 1832 when high tariff congressmen ignored Southern warnings that they were endangering the Union in reenacting the Tariff of Abominations. In response, leading South Carolinians called a state convention, which in November boldly adopted an ordinance of nullification declaring the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 to be null and void. The ordinance of nullification is an important vocabulary term to pay attention to because it will pop up again. Something similar will pop up, but you can also tie it back to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So focusing on that historical thinking skill the historical thinking skill of continuity and change over time. The ordinance prohibited the collection of those duties in South Carolina after February 1st, 1833, and threatened secession if federal officials tried to collect them. So here, South Carolina's on the road to its discussion of secession already. South Carolina's act of nullification, again, another vocabulary term, the argument that a state has the right to void within its borders a law passed by Congress, rested on the constitutional arguments developed in the South Carolina Exposition and Protest of 1828. And we'll be taking a look at that as a primary source. Written anonymously by Vice President John C. Calhoun, the exposition gave a localist or sectional interpretation to the federal union. Because each state or geographic region had distinct interests, localists argued protective tariffs and other national legislation that operated unequally on the various states lacked fairness and legitimacy. In fact, they were unconstitutional. An obsessive defender of the interests of Southern slave owners, Calhoun exaggerated the frequency and severity of such legislation, declaring, quote, "Constitutional government and the government of a majority are utterly incompatible," end quote. Calhoun's constitutional doctrines reflected the arguments advanced by Jefferson and Madison in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. Those resolutions asserted that because state-based conventions had ratified the Constitution, sovereignty lay in the states, not in the people. Beginning from this premise, Calhoun argued that a state convention could declare a congressional law to be void within the state's borders. Replying to the states' rights, another vocabulary term, interpretation of the Constitution, which had little support in the text of the document, Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts presented a nationalist interpretation that celebrated popular sovereignty and Congress's responsibility to secure the general welfare. Popular sovereignty is another term, even though it's not on our list of identified vocab terms, probably should take a look at popular sovereignty. Jackson hoped to find a middle path between Webster's strident nationalism and Calhoun's radical doctrine of localist federalism. The Constitution clearly gave the federal government the authority to establish tariffs, and Jackson vowed to enforce it. He declared that South Carolina's ordinance of nullification violated the letter of the Constitution and was, quote, destructive of the great object for which it was formed, end quote. More pointedly, he warned, quote, disunion by armed force is treason, end quote. At Jackson's request, Congress in early 1833 passed a military force bill being a vocab term, authorizing the president to compel South Carolina's obedience to national laws. Simultaneously, Jackson addressed the South's objections to high import duties with a new tariff act that, over the course of a decade, reduced rates to the modest levels of 1816. Subsequently, export-hungry Midwestern wheat farmers joined Southern planters in advocating low duties to avoid retaliatory tariffs by foreign nations. Illinois wants a market for her agricultural products, declared Senator Sidney Breese in 1848. She wants the market of the world. Having won the political battle by securing a tariff reduction, the South Carolina Convention did not press its constitutional stance on nullification. Jackson was satisfied. He had assisted the South economically while upholding the constitutional principle of national authority, a principle that Abraham Lincoln would embrace to defend the Union during the secession crisis of 1861. And now on to Jackson's Bank War, starting on page 325. In the midst of the tariff crisis, Jackson faced a major challenge from politicians who supported the Second Bank of the United States. And I want you to identify kind of the characteristics of the Second Bank of the United States and the significance of it. Founded in Philadelphia in 1816, the bank was privately managed and operated under a 20-year charter from the federal government, which owned 20% of its stock. The bank's most important role was to stabilize the nation's money supply, primarily of notes and bills of credit, in effect, paper money, issued by state-chartered banks. Those banks promised to redeem the notes on demand with hard money, or specie, meaning gold or silver coins minted by the US or foreign governments, but there were few coins in circulation. By collecting those notes and regularly demanding specie, the Second Bank kept the state banks from issuing too much paper money and depreciating its value. This cautious monetary policy pleased creditors. The bankers and the entrepreneurs in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia estimates were underwriting economic development. Expansion-minded bankers, including friends of Jackson's in Nashville, demanded an end to central oversight. Many ordinary Americans worried that the Second Bank would force weak banks to close, leaving them holding worthless paper notes. Many politicians resented the arrogance of the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle. As to mere power, Biddle boasted, I have been for years in the daily exercise of more personal authority than any president habitually enjoys. So the next part of this section is Jackson's bank veto. The bank had many enemies. A political miscalculation by its friends brought its downfall. In 1832, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster persuaded Biddle to seek an early extension of the bank's charter, which still had 4 years to run. They had the votes in Congress to enact the required legislation and hoped to lure Jackson into a veto that would split the Democrats just before the 1832 elections. Jackson turned the tables on Clay and Webster. He vetoed the rechartering bill with a masterful message that blended constitutional arguments with class rhetoric and patriotic fervor. Adopting the position taken by Thomas Jefferson in 1793, Congress had no constitutional authority bank. He condemned the bank as subversive of the rights of the states, dangerous to the liberties of the people, and a privileged monopoly that promoted the advancement of the few at the expense of farmers, mechanics, and laborers. Finally, the president noted that British aristocrats owned much of the bank's stock. Such a powerful institution should be purely American, Jackson declared with patriotic zeal. Jackson's attack on the bank carried him to victory in 1832. Old Hickory and Martin Van Buren, his new running mate, overwhelmed Henry Clay, who headed the National Republican ticket, by 219 to 49 electoral votes. Jackson's most fervent supporters were Eastern workers and Western farmers, who blamed the Second Bank for high urban prices and stagnant farm income. All the flourishing cities of the West are mortgaged to this money power, charged Senator Thomas Hart Benton, a Jacksonian from Missouri. Still, many of Jackson's supporters had prospered during a decade of strong economic growth. Thousands of middle-class Americans, including lawyers, clerks, shopkeepers, and artisans, had used the opportunity to rise in the world and cheered Jackson's attack on privileged corporations. Early in 1833, Jackson met their wishes by appointing Roger B. Taney, a strong opponent of corporate privilege, as head of the Treasury Department. Taney promptly transferred the federal government's gold and silver from the Second Bank to various state banks, which critics labeled Jackson's pet banks. To justify this abrupt and probably illegal transfer, Jackson declared that his re-election represented the decision of the people against the bank and gave him a mandate to destroy it. This sweeping claim of presidential power was new and radical. Never before had a president claimed that victory at the polls allowed him to pursue a controversial policy or to act independently of Congress. The bank war escalated into an all-out political battle, and I do want you to make sure that you make notations about the bank war in your notes. In March 1834, Jackson's opponents in the Senate passed a resolution composed by Henry Clay that censured the president and warned of executive tyranny. We are in the midst of a revolution, hitherto bloodless, but rapidly descending towards a total change of the pure Republican character of the government and the concentration of all power in the hands of one man. Clay's charges and Congress's censure did not deter Jackson. The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it, he vowed to Van Buren, and so he did. When the Second Bank's national charter expired in 1836, Jackson prevented its renewal. Jackson had destroyed both national banking, the handiwork of Alexander Hamilton, and the American system of protective tariffs and public works created by Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. The result was a profound check on economic activism and innovative policymaking by the national government. All is gone, observed a Washington newspaper correspondent. All is gone, which the general government was instituted to create and preserve. Moving on to Jackson's Indian removal policies. The status of Native American peoples posed an equally complex political problem. By the late 1820s, white voices throughout the South and Midwest demanded the resettlement of Indian peoples west of the Mississippi River. Many whites who were sympathetic to Native Americans also favored resettlement. Removal to the West seemed the only way to protect Indians from alcoholism, financial exploitation, and cultural decline. However, most Indians did not want to leave their ancestral lands. For centuries, Cherokees and Creeks had lived in Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama, Chickasaw and Choctaw in Mississippi and Alabama, and Seminole in Florida. During the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson had forced the Creeks to relinquish millions of acres, but Indian tribes still controlled vast tracts and wanted to keep them. Cherokee resistance. But on what terms? Some Indians had adopted white ways. An 1825 census revealed that various Cherokees owned 33 grist mills, 13 sawmills, 2,400 spinning wheels, 760 looms, and 2,900 plows. Many of these owners were mixed race, the offspring of white traders and Indian women. They had grown up in a bicultural world, knew the political and economic ways of whites, and often favored assimilation into white society. Furthermore, the Cherokee had adopted their own constitution, their own governing document that was modeled off of the United States Constitution. Indeed, some of these mixed race people were indistinguishable from Southern planters. At his death in 1809, Georgia Cherokee James Vann owned 100 black slaves, 2 trading posts, and a grist mill. 3 decades later, 40 other mixed-blood Cherokee families each owned 10 or more African American workers. Prominent mixed-race Cherokee believed that integration into American life was the best way to protect their property and the lands of the people. Sequoyah, a part Cherokee silversmith, perfected a system of writing for the Cherokee language. 6 years later, mixed-race Cherokees devised a new charter of Cherokee government modeled directly on the United States Constitution. Quote, "You asked us to throw off the hunter and warrior state," Cherokee John Ridge told a Philadelphia audience in 1832. "We did so. You asked us to form a Republican government. We did so. You asked us to learn to read. We did so. You asked us to cast away our idols and worship your God. We did so." End quote. Full-blooded Cherokees, who made up 90% of the population, resisted many of these cultural and political innovations, but were equally determined to retain their ancestral lands. "We would not receive money for land in which our fathers and friends are buried," one full-blood chief declared. "We love our land. It is our mother." What the Cherokees did or wanted carried no weight with the Georgia legislature. In 1802, Georgia had given up its western land claims in return for a federal promise to extinguish Indian land holdings in the state. Now it demanded fulfillment of that pledge. Having spent his military career fighting Indians and seizing their lands, Andrew Jackson gave full support to Georgia. On assuming the presidency, he withdrew the federal troops that had protected Indian enclaves there and in Alabama and Mississippi. The states, he declared, were sovereign within their borders. The Removal Act and its aftermath. Jackson then pushed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, an important vocabulary term, through Congress over the determined opposition of evangelical Protestant men and women. To block removal, Catherine Beecher and Lydia Sigourney composed a lady circular, which urged benevolent ladies to use prayers and exertions to avert the calamity of removal. Women from across the nation flooded Congress with petitions. Nonetheless, Jackson's bill squeaked through the House of Representatives by a vote of 102 to 97. The Removal Act created the Indian Territory on national lands acquired in the Louisiana Purchase and located it in present-day Oklahoma and Kansas. It promised money and reserved land to Native American peoples who would give up their ancestral holdings east of the Mississippi River. Government officials promised the Indians that they could live on their new land, quote, they and all their children as long as grass grows and water runs, end quote. However, as one Indian leader noted on the Great Plains, quote, water and timber are scarcely to be seen, end quote, when Chief Black Hawk and his Sauk and Fox followers refused to leave rich, well-watered farmland in western Illinois in 1832, Jackson sent troops to expel them by force. Eventually, the U.S. Army pursued Black Hawk into the Wisconsin Territory, and in the brutal 8-hour Bad Axe Massacre, killed 850 of his 1,000 warriors. Over the next 5 years, American diplomatic pressure and military power forced 70 Indian peoples to sign treaties and move west to the Mississippi, as referenced on map 10.3 on page 330. In the meantime, the Cherokees had carried the defense of their lands to the Supreme Court, where they claimed the status of a foreign nation. In the court case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia of 1831, and that's a Supreme Court case you need to know, Chief Justice John Marshall denied that claim and declared that Indian peoples were domestic dependent nations. However, in Worcester versus Georgia of 1832, another important Supreme Court case you need to know, Marshall and the court sided with the Cherokees against Georgia. Voiding Georgia's extension of state law over the Cherokee, the court held that Indian nations were distinct political communities having territorial boundaries within which their authority is exclusive and is guaranteed by the United States. Instead of guaranteeing the Cherokees' territory, the United States government took it from them. In 1835, American officials and a minority Cherokee faction negotiated the Treaty of New Echota, which specified that Cherokees would resettle in Indian Territory. When only 2,000 of 17,000 Cherokee had moved by the May 1838 deadline, President Martin Van Buren ordered General Winfield Scott to enforce the treaty. Scott's army rounded up 14,000 Cherokee, including mixed-race African Cherokees, and marched them 1,200 miles, an arduous journey that became known as the Trail of Tears, a vocabulary term. Along the way, 3,000 Indians died of starvation and exposure. Once in Oklahoma, the Cherokees excluded anyone of Negro or mulatto parentage from governmental office, thereby affirming that full citizenship in their nation was racially defined. Just as the United States was a white man's country, so too Indian country would be defined as a red man's country. Encouraged by generous gifts of land, the Creeks, Chickasaws, and Choctaws moved west of the Mississippi, leaving the Seminole in Florida as the only numerically significant Indian people remaining in the Southeast. Government pressure persuaded about half of the Seminole to migrate to Indian Territory, but families whose ancestors had intermarried with runaway slaves feared the emphasis on blood purity there. During the 1840s, they fought a successful guerrilla war against the United States Army and retained their lands in central Florida. These Seminole were the exception. The Jacksonians had forced the removal of most eastern Indian peoples. Next, we're going to take a look at the Jacksonian impact, beginning on page 331. Jackson's legacy, like that of every other great president, is complex and rich. On the institutional level, he expanded the authority of the nation's chief executive. As Jackson put it, the president is the direct representative of the people. Assuming that role during the nullification crisis, he upheld national authority by threatening the use of military force, laying the foundation for Lincoln's defense of the Union a generation later. At the same time, and somewhat contradictorily, Jackson curbed the reach of the national government. By undermining Henry Clay's American system of national banking, protective tariffs, and internal improvements, Jackson reinvigorated the Jeffersonian tradition of a limited and frugal central government. Now we're going to take a look at the Taney Court. Jackson also undermined the constitutional jurisprudence of John Marshall by appointing Roger B. Taney as his successor in 1835. During his long tenure as Chief Justice from 1835 to 1864, Taney partially reversed the nationalist and vested property rights decisions of the Marshall Court and gave constitutional legitimacy to Jackson's policies of states' rights and free enterprise. In the landmark case of Charles River Bridge Company versus Warren Bridge Company of 1837, another Supreme Court case you need to investigate, Taney declared that a legislative charter, in this case to build and operate a toll bridge, did not necessarily bestow a monopoly, and that a legislature could charter a competing bridge to promote the general welfare. While the rights of private property are sacredly guarded, we must not forget that the community also has rights. This decision directly challenged Marshall's interpretation of the contract clause of the Constitution in Dartmouth College versus Woodward of 1819, which we took a look at, which had stressed the binding nature of public charters and the sanctity of vested rights. By limiting the property claims of existing canal and turnpike companies, Taney's decision allowed legislatures to charter competing railroads that would provide cheaper and more efficient transportation. The Taney Court also limited Marshall's nationalistic interpretation of the Commerce Clause by enhancing the regulatory role of state governments. For example, in Mayor of New York versus Milne in 1837, another Supreme Court case to take a look at, the Taney Court ruled that New York State could use its police power to inspect the health of arriving immigrants. The court also restored to the states some of the economic powers they had exercised prior to the Constitution of 1787. In Briscoe versus Bank of Kentucky, 1837, the justices allowed a bank owned by the state of Kentucky to issue currency, despite the wording of Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which prohibits states from issuing bills of credit. States revised their constitutions on page 332. Inspired by Jackson and Taney, Democrats in the various states mounted their own constitutional revolutions. Between 1830 and 1860, 20 states called conventions that furthered democratic principles by reapportioning state legislatures on the basis of population and giving the vote to all white men. Voters also had more power because the new documents mandated the election, rather than the appointment, of most public officials, including sheriffs, justices of the peace, and judges. The new constitutions also embodied the principles of classic liberalism or laissez-faire by limiting the government's role in the economy. Again, you need to define classic liberalism and laissez-faire. 20th century social welfare liberalism endorses the opposite principle, that government should intervene in economic and social life. As president, Jackson had destroyed the American system, and his disciples now attacked the state-based Commonwealth system, which used chartered corporations and state funds to promote economic development. Most Jackson-era constitutions prohibited states from granting special charters to corporations and extending loans and credit guarantees to private businesses. If there is any danger to be feared in government, declared a New Jersey Democrat, it is the danger of associated wealth with special privileges. Constitutions also protected taxpayers by setting strict limits on state debt and encouraging judges to enforce them. Said New York reformer Michael Hoffman, "We will not trust the legislature with the power of creating indefinite mortgages on the people's property." The world is governed too much, the Jacksonians proclaimed as they embraced a small government, laissez-faire outlook, and celebrated the power of ordinary people to make decisions in the voting booth and in the marketplace. Moving on to section 3 of chapter 10, it's entitled Class, Culture, and the Second Party System. Previously in the past on the AP exam, there have been questions about the second party system. So make sure that if you have questions regarding it, that you email me those questions. The rise of the democracy and Jackson's tumultuous presidency sparked the creation in the mid 1830s of a second national party, the Whigs, WHIGS. For the next 2 decades, Whigs and Democrats competed fiercely for votes and appealed to different cultural groups. Many evangelical Protestants became Whigs, while most Catholic immigrants and traditional Protestants joined the Democrats. By debating issues of economic policy, class power, and moral reform, party politicians offered Americans a choice between competing programs and political leaders. Quote, "Of the two great parties," remarked philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, "the democracy has the best cause for free trade, for wide suffrage, but the Whig Party has the best men." End quote. The Whig worldview. The Whig Party arose in 1834 when a group of congressmen contested Andrew Jackson's policies and his high-handed, king-like conduct. They took the name Whigs to identify themselves with the pre-revolutionary American and British parties, also called Whigs, that had opposed the arbitrary actions of British monarchs. The Whigs accused, quote, King Andrew I, end quote, of violating the Constitution by creating a spoil system and undermining elected legislators, whom they saw as the true representatives of the sovereign people. One Whig accused Jackson of ruling in a manner, quote, more absolute than that of any absolute monarchy of Europe, end quote. Initially, the Whigs consisted of political factions with distinct points of view. However, guided by Senators Webster of Massachusetts, Clay of Kentucky, and Calhoun of South Carolina, they gradually coalesced into a party with a distinctive stance and coherent ideology. Like the Federalists of the 1790s, the Whigs wanted a political world dominated by men of ability and wealth. Unlike the Federalists, they advocated an elite based on talent, not birth. The Whigs celebrated the entrepreneur and the enterprising individual. This is a country of self-made men, they boasted, pointing to the relative absence of permanent distinctions of class and status among white citizens. Embracing the Industrial Revolution, Northern Whigs welcomed the investments of moneyed capitalists, which provided workers with jobs and bread, clothing, and homes. Indeed, Whig Congressman Edward Everett championed a holy alliance among laborers, owners, and government, and called for a return to Henry Clay's American system. Many New England and Pennsylvania textile and iron workers shared Everett's vision because they benefited directly from protective tariffs. Now we're going to take a look at Calhoun's dissent. Support for the Whigs in the South, less widespread than that in the North, rested on the appeal of specific policies and politicians. Some Southern Whigs were wealthy planters who invested in railroads and banks or sold their cotton to New York merchants. But the majority were yeoman whites who resented the power and policies of low country planters, most of whom were Democrats. In addition, some Virginia and South Carolina Democrats, such as John Taylor, became Whigs because they condemned Andrew Jackson's crusade against nullification. Southern Whigs rejected their party's enthusiasm for high tariffs and social mobility, and John C. Calhoun was their spokesperson. Extremely conscious of class divisions in society, Calhoun believed that Northern Whigs' rhetoric of equal opportunity was contradicted not only by slavery, which he considered a fundamental American institution, no longer a necessary evil, but also by the wage labor system of industrial capitalism. There is and always has been in an advanced state of wealth and civilization a conflict between labor and capital, Calhoun declared in 1837. He urged slave owners and factory owners to unite against their common foe, the working class of enslaved blacks and propertyless whites. Most Northern Whigs rejected Calhoun's class-conscious social ideology. Quote, a clear and well-defined line between capital and labor, end quote, might fit slave South or class-ridden Europe, Daniel Webster conceded, but in the North, quote, this distinction grows less and less definite as commerce advances, end quote. Ignoring the ever-increasing numbers of propertyless immigrants and native-born wage workers, Webster focused on the growing size of the middle class, whose members generally favored Whig candidates. In the election of 1834, The Whigs took control of the House of Representatives by appealing to evangelical Protestants and upwardly mobile families, prosperous farmers, small town merchants, and skilled industrial workers in New England, New York, and the new communities along the Great Lakes. Next, we're going to read about the anti-Masons becoming Whigs. Many Whig voters in 1834 had previously supported the anti-Masons, a powerful but short-lived party that formed in the late 1820s. As its name implies, anti-Masons opposed the order of Freemasonry. Freemasonry began in Europe as an organization of men seeking moral improvement by promoting the welfare and unity of humanity. Many Masons espoused republicanism, and the order spread rapidly in America after the Revolution. Its ideology, mysterious symbols, and semi-secret character gave the order an air of exclusivity that attracted ambitious businessmen and political leaders, including George Washington, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. In New York State alone, by the mid-1820s, there were more than 20,000 Masons organized into 450 local lodges. However, after the kidnapping and murder in 1826 of William Morgan, a New York Mason who had threatened to reveal the order's secrets, the Freemasons fell into disrepute. Thurlow Weed, a newspaper editor in Rochester, New York, spearheaded an anti-Masonic party, which condemned the order as a secret aristocratic fraternity. The new party quickly ousted Freemasons from local and state offices and just as quickly ran out of political steam. Because many anti-Masons espoused temperance, equality of opportunity, and evangelical morality, they gravitated to the Whig Party. Throughout the Northeast and Midwest, Whig politicians won election by proposing legal curbs on the sale of alcohol and local ordinance that preserved Sunday as a day of worship. The Whigs also secured the votes of farmers, bankers, and shopkeepers who favored Henry Clay's American system. For these citizens of the growing Midwest, the Whigs' program of government subsidies for roads, canals, and bridges was as important as their moral agenda. In the election of 1836, the Whig Party faced Martin Van Buren, the architect of the Democratic Party and Jackson's hand-picked successor. Like Jackson, Van Buren denounced the American system and warned that its rival would create a consolidated government. Positioning himself as a defender of individual rights, Van Buren also condemned the efforts of Whigs and moral reformers to enact state laws imposing temperance and national laws abolishing slavery. The government is best which governs least became his motto in economic, cultural, and racial matters. To oppose Van Buren, the Whigs ran 4 candidates, each with a strong regional reputation. They hoped to garner enough electoral votes to throw the contest into the House of Representatives. However, the Whig tally, 73 electoral votes collected by William Henry Harrison of Ohio, 26 by Hugh L. White of Tennessee, 14 by Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and 11 by W.P. Macnam of Georgia, fell far short of Van Buren's 170 votes. Still, the 4 Whigs won 49% of the popular vote, showing that the party's message of economic and moral improvement had broad appeal. So now we're going to read about labor politics in the Depression of 1837 through 1843. As the Democrats battled Whigs on the national level, they faced challenges from urban artisans and workers. Between 1828 and 1833, artisans and laborers in 15 states formed working men's parties. Past experience teaches us that we have nothing to hope from the aristocratic orders of society, declared the New York Working Men's Party. It vowed to send men of our own description, if we can, to the legislature at Albany. The new party's agenda reflected the values and interests of ordinary urban workers. The Philadelphia Working Men's Party set out to secure a just balance of power between all the various classes. It called for the abolition of private banks, chartered monopolies, and debtors' prisons, and it demanded universal public education and a fair system of taxation. It won some victories, electing a number of assemblymen and persuading the Pennsylvania legislature in 1834 to authorize tax-supported schools. Elsewhere, working men's candidates won office in many cities, but their party's weakness in statewide contests soon took a toll. By the mid-1830s, most politically active workers had joined the Democratic Party. The working men's parties left a mixed legacy. They mobilized craft workers and gave political expression to their ideology of artisan republicanism. As labor intellectual Orestes Brownson defined their distinctive vision, All men will be independent proprietors, working on their own capitals, on their own farms, or in their own shops. However, this emphasis on proprietorship inhibited alliances between the artisan-based working men's parties and the rapidly increasing class of dependent wage earners. As Joseph Weidemeyer, a close friend of Karl Marx, reported from New York in the early 1850s, many American craft workers are incipient bourgeois and feel themselves to be such. Moreover, the Panic of 1837, and again, that's an event that I want you to make sure that you include in your notes. One moment, please. However, the Panic of 1837 threw the American economy and the workers' movement into disarray. The panic began when the Bank of England tried to boost the faltering British economy by sharply curtailing the flow of money and credit to the United States. Since 1822, British manufacturers had extended credit to Southern planters to expand cotton production, and British investors had purchased millions of dollars of the canal bonds from the northern states. Suddenly deprived of British funds, American planters, merchants, and canal corporations had to withdraw gold from domestic banks to pay for their foreign debts. Moreover, British textile mills dramatically reduced their purchases of raw cotton, causing its price to plummet from 20 cents a pound to 10 cents or less. Falling cotton prices and the drain of specie to Britain set off a financial panic. On May 8th, the Dry Dock Bank of New York City ran out of specie, prompting worried depositors to withdraw gold and silver coins from other banks. Within 2 weeks, every American had stopped trading specie and called in its loans, turning a financial panic into an economic crisis. This sudden overthrow of the commercial credit had a stunning effect, observed Henry Fox, the British minister in Washington. The conquest of the land by a foreign power could hardly have produced a more general sense of humiliation and grief. To stimulate the economy, state governments increased their investments in canals and railroads. However, as governments issued or guaranteed more and more bonds to finance these ventures, they were unable to pay the interest charges, sparking a severe financial crisis on both sides of the Atlantic in 1839. 9 state governments defaulted on their debts, and hard-pressed European lenders cut the flow of new capital to the United States. The American economy fell into a deep depression. By 1843, canal construction had dropped by 90%. Prices and wages had fallen by 50%, and unemployment in seaports and industrial centers had reached 20%. Bumper crops drove down cotton prices, pushing hundreds of planters and merchants into bankruptcy. Minister Henry Ward Beecher described a land filled with lamentation, its inhabitants wandering like bereaved citizens among the ruins of an earthquake, mourning for their children, for houses crushed, and property buried forever. By creating a surplus of unemployed workers, the Depression completed the decline of the union movement and the working men's parties. In 1837, 6,000 masons, carpenters, and other building trades workers lost their jobs in New York City, destroying their union's bargaining power. By 1843, most local unions, all the national labor organizations, and all the workers' parties had disappeared. Now we're going to read about Tippecanoe and Tyler too, starting on page 335. Many Americans blamed the Democrats for the Depression of 1837 through 1843. They criticized Jackson for destroying the Second Bank and directing the Treasury Department in 1836 to issue the Specie Circular. And Specie Circular is a vocabulary term. Make sure you include that in your notes, which is an executive order that required the Treasury Department to accept only gold and silver in payment for lands in the national domain. Critics charged, mistakenly, that the circular drained so much specie from the economy that it sparked the Panic of 1837. In fact, as noted above, the curtailing of credit by the Bank of England was the main cause of the panic. Nonetheless, the public turned its anger on Van Buren, who took office just before the panic struck. Ignoring the pleas of influential bankers, the new president refused to revoke the Specie Circular or take actions to stimulate the economy. Holding to his philosophy of limited government, Van Buren advised Congress that the less government interferes with private pursuits, the better for the general prosperity. If that's not laissez-faire, I don't know what is. As the Depression deepened in 1839, this laissez-faire outlook commanded less and less political support. Worse, Van Buren's major piece of fiscal legislation, the Independent Treasury Act of 1840, delayed recovery by pulling federal specie out of Jackson's pet banks, where it had backed loans, and placing it in government vaults, where it had little economic impact. So now we're going to see the Log Cabin Campaign. The Whigs exploited Van Buren's weaknesses. In 1840, they organized their first national convention and nominated William Henry Harrison of Ohio for president and John Tyler of Virginia for vice president. A military hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe and the War of 1812, Harrison was well advanced in age, 68, and had little political experience. However, the Whig leaders in Congress, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, wanted a president who would rubber stamp their programs for protective tariffs and a national bank. An unpretentious, amiable man, Harrison told voters that Whig policies were the only means under heaven by which a poor, industrious man may become a rich man without bowing to colossal wealth. The Depression stacked the political cards against Van Buren, but the election turned as much on style as on substance. It became the great Log Cabin Campaign, the first time two well-organized parties competed for votes through a new style of campaigning. Whig songfests, parades, and well-orchestrated mass meetings drew new voters into politics. Whig speakers assailed Martin Van Ruin as a manipulative politician with aristocratic tastes, a devotee of fancy wines, elegant clothes, and political refinement, as indeed he was. Less truthfully, they portrayed Harrison as a self-made man who lived contentedly in a log cabin and quaffed hard cider, a drink of the common people. In fact, Harrison's father was a wealthy Virginia planter who had signed the Declaration of Independence, and Harrison himself lived in a series of elegant mansions. The Whigs boosted their electoral hopes by welcoming women to campaign festivities, a first for American politics. Many Jacksonian Democrats had long embraced an ideology of aggressive manhood, likening politically minded females to public women, prostitutes who plied their trade in theaters and other public places. Whigs took a more restrained view of masculinity and recognized that Christian women had already entered American public life through the temperance movement and other benevolent activities. In October of 1840, Daniel Webster celebrated moral reform to an audience of 1,200 women and urged them to back Whig candidates. "This way of making politicians of their women is something new under the sun," exclaimed one Democrat, worried that it would bring more Whig men to the polls. More than 80% of the eligible male voters cast ballots in 1840, up from fewer than 60% in 1832 and 1836. Haynes' slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," they voted Harrison into the White House with 53% of the popular vote, majority in Congress. Next part of this is Tyler subverts the Whig agenda. Webster, the Whigs in Congress prepared to reverse the Jacksonian Revolution. Their hopes were short-lived. Barely a month after his inauguration in 1841, Harrison died of pneumonia, and the nation got Tyler too. But in what capacity? As acting president or as president? The Constitution was vague on the issue. Ignoring his Whig associates in Congress, who wanted a weak chief executive, Tyler took the presidential oath of office and declared his intention to govern as he pleased. As it turned out, that would not be like a Whig. Tyler had served in the House and the Senate as a Jeffersonian Democrat, firmly committed to slavery and states' rights. He had joined the Whigs only to protest Jackson's stance against nullification. On economic issues, Tyler shared Jackson's hostility to the Second Bank and the American system. He therefore vetoed Whig bills that would have raised tariffs and created a new national bank. Outraged by this betrayal, most of Tyler's cabinet resigned in 1842, and the Whigs expelled Tyler from their party. His accidency, as he was called by his critics, was now a president without a party. The split between Tyler and the Whigs allowed the Democrats to regroup. The party vigorously recruited subsistence farmers in the North, smallholding planters in the South, and former members of the workingmen's parties in the cities. It also won support among Irish and German Catholic immigrants, whose numbers had increased during the 1830s by backing their demands for religious and cultural liberty such as the freedom to drink beer and whiskey. A pattern of ethnocultural politics, and that's a vocabulary term I want you to know, as historians refer to the practice of voting along ethnic and religious lines, now became a prominent feature of American life. Thanks to these urban and rural recruits, the Democrats remained the majority party in most of the nation. Their program of equal rights, states' rights, and cultural liberty was attractive to more white Americans than the Whig platform of economic nationalism, moral reform, temperance laws, and individual mobility. So, in summary, in this chapter, we examined the causes and the consequences of the Democratic political revolution. We saw that the expansion of the franchise weakened the political system run by notables of high status and encouraged the transfer of power to professional politicians, men like Martin Van Buren, who were mostly of middle class origin. We also witnessed a revolution in government policy as Andrew Jackson and his Democratic Party dismantled the mercantilist economic system of government-supported economic development. On the national level, Jackson destroyed Henry Clay's American system. On the state level, Democrats wrote new constitutions that ended the Commonwealth system of government charters and subsidies to private businesses. Jackson's treatment of Native Americans was equally revolutionary. The Removal Act of 1830 forcefully resettled Eastern Indian peoples west of the Mississippi River, opening their ancestral lands to white settlement. Finally, we watched the emergence of the second party system. Following the split in the Republican Party during the election of 1824, two new parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, developed on the national level and eventually absorbed the members of the anti-Masonic and working men's parties. The new party system established universal suffrage for white men and a mode of representative government that was responsive to ordinary citizens. In their scope and significance, these political innovations matched the economic advances of both the industrial and market revolutions. So the vocabulary terms that I want you to make sure you know include franchise, which is the right to vote. Between 1820 and 1860, most states revised their constitutions to extend the vote to all adult white men. Notables. Notables are northern landlords, slave-owning planters, and seaport merchants who dominated the political system. Political machine. A political machine is a highly organized group of insiders that directs a political party. Spoils system. The spoils system is the widespread award of public jobs to political supporters after an electoral victory. In 1829, Andrew Jackson instituted the system on the national level, arguing that the rotation of office holders was preferable to a permanent group of bureaucrats. Caucus. A caucus is a meeting held by a political party to choose candidates, make policies, and enforce party discipline. The American system is the mercantilist system of national economic development advocated by Henry Clay and adopted by John Quincy Adams, with a national bank to manage the nation's financial system, protective tariffs to provide revenue and encourage industry, and a nationally funded network of roads, canals, and railroads. Internal improvements are public works such as roads and canals. The corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain is a term used by Andrew Jackson's supporters for the appointment of President John Quincy Adams of Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, the traditional stepping stone to the presidency. Consolidated government is a term meaning a powerful and potentially oppressive national government. The Tariff of Abominations was a tariff enacted in 1828 that raised duty significantly on raw materials, textiles, and iron goods. New York Senator Van Buren hoped to win the support of farmers in New York, Ohio, and Kentucky with the tariff, but it enraged the South. Nullification. Nullification is the constitutional argument advanced by John C. Calhoun that a state legislature or convention could void a law passed by Congress. States' rights is an interpretation of the Constitution that exalts the sovereignty of the states and circumscribes the authority of the national government. The Second Bank of the United States is a national bank with multiple branches chartered in 1816 for 20 years. Intended to help regulate the economy, the bank became a major issue in Andrew Jackson's re-election campaign in 1832, framed in political rhetoric about aristocracy versus democracy. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was an act that directed the mandatory relocation of Eastern tribes to territory west of the Mississippi. The Trail of Tears forced westward journey of Cherokees from their lands in Georgia to present-day Oklahoma in 1838. Nearly a quarter of the Cherokees died en route. Classical liberalism, also known as laissez-faire, is the principle that the less government does, the better, particularly in reference to economy. The Whigs. The Second National Party, the Whig Party, arose in 1834 when a group of congressmen contested Andrew Jackson's policies and conduct. The party identified itself with the pre-revolutionary American and British parties, also called Whigs, that had opposed the arbitrary actions of British monarchs. The Panic of 1837 is the second major economic crisis of the United States, which led to hard times from 1837 to 1843. Is Specie Circular. Specie Circular is an executive order in 1836 that required the Treasury Department to accept only gold and silver in payment for lands in the national domain. And then finally, the last term is ethnocultural politics. Ethnocultural politics refers to the fact that the political allegiance of many American voters was determined less by party policy than by their membership in a specific ethnic or religious group. Some key people to make sure that you understand their significance include Martin Van Buren, and you can find more information about him on page 317. John Quincy Adams, more information can be found on page 318. Henry Clay, more information on page 319. Andrew Jackson, also on page 319. John C. Calhoun on page 324. Daniel Webster, also on page 324. Nicholas Biddle, more information to be found on page 326. Roger B. Taney, more information to be found on page 331. And finally, John Tyler, more info to be found on page 339. So some questions that I would encourage you to have discussion with your parents about would include, number one, how did Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party fundamentally change public policy? With specific examples. Number two, what were the various constitutional arguments underlying the debates over internal improvements, the tariff, and nullification? And then number three, how and why did the policies of the federal and state governments toward Native Americans change between the 1790s, and you can refer back to chapter 7 for that information, and the 1850s, and what were the reactions of Indian peoples to those policies? So that concludes chapter 10, A Democratic Revolution, the rise of the Democratic Party, along with the Whig Party, the rise of Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and Mr. Tyler. Enjoy your studies of chapter 10. I'll be back with information, reading to you chapter 11.